Good morning, everybody. This is Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School, and today we have a very interesting program with Sigve Tonstad continuing our discussion on Revelation. Peter, could you please lead us in prayer and readings?
Good morning to all. The Bible reading today will be from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, and I'll be reading verses 1 to 5. And I've chosen the New International Version. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Thank God for these wonderful promises. Let us pray. Holy Father, there is no a better place for us to be today than to sit at Jesus' feet and to listen and to learn more about his love and what he has in store for each one of us. Please bless each one of us, the special blessing upon Dr. Sigve Tonstad that will be with us today. And help us not to be only good listeners, but also good doers. In Jesus' precious name, I pray. Amen. As Simona mentioned, today we are going to have with us Dr. Sigve Tonstad, coming to us on Zoom from the beautiful Norwegian fjords. And to use Dave Larson words about how he characterized him, he is a fully qualified physician and a fully qualified Bible scholar. He got his degrees, the medical degree from Loma University, and his theological, his PhD degree from St. Andrew University from Scotland. And Andrew is one of the oldest universities in Europe. It's a Protestant university. Dr. Tonstad, he is spending basically his time divided between Norway, where he's practicing medicine, and Loma Linda, where he is teaching in the Loma Linda School of Medicine. He authored several books. I will mention a few of them. A few of these titles: God of Sense and the Traditions of Nonsense, The Lost Meaning of the Sabbath, Letters to the Romans, and the book of Revelation that we are going to study today. He's married. His wife is also a fully qualified physician. They have 2 daughters. And we are now ready for the movie.
To Revelation. And mind you, I do not think this is a presentation of how or mostly how I think Revelation should be read. Many people have read this book before we do, and schools of thought have developed that we need to be aware of, and then see what we would like to gain from those approaches and what we might like to disagree with or even dismiss. So what are these schools of interpretation, and what do they see, or what do they claim to see? That's what we will ask to begin with. So here is the first one. That's the preterist school. Preterism refers to the past, and this is that person looking into the past through a magnifying glass. His focus now as a reader of Revelation is the first century. It's the time of the writer of the book. And the claim here is that the focus in Revelation is the first century and events in Rome, in the Roman Empire. That's the preterist school. Now the futurist school goes to the complete opposite. If the preterist is the time of the writer, the futurist interpretation is the time of the reader. That is to say, our time. And so he is turned to the past. Here, the futurist claims that John was oriented toward the future and that he sees the future and sees the future in which we live in, so our time. And then you have the historicist school, and the historicist horizon is wider because he claims to see the past or the time of John and history all the way from the time of John to our time. So a wider horizon, but tending to end in the time of the reader. So let's summarize here. Preterist, time of the writer. Futurist, time of the reader, obviously very different. And historicist, history, leading to the time of the reader. So there is a bias, a trend here that will also put the reader's time into perspective. So more about these schools. What do they read? What's the curriculum that you will find in these schools? And in the preterist school, there will be books on the Roman Empire, about Julius Caesar and the Emperor Augustus, and a lot about the imperial cult in Asia Minor, and a lot about the life and time of the Emperor Nero. And he is given a role. He is assumed to be a figure in Revelation in the preterist school. What does the futurist read? Well, he or she reads the newspaper. He doesn't read books. And the reading curriculum of the futurist is much smaller. And it is the news items in our time, late 20th century, early 21st century, and applying the symbols of Revelation to events in the time of the reader. And then the historicist, what does the historicist read? Well, he or she reads history, and that history might just go all the way back to the time of John, but it tends to be church history. So maybe one should have specified history, and then church history, and then history also in the time of the reader. So from the time of John to the time of the reader, with a tendency to favor the time of the reader. And who are they then? These schools of interpretation. Well, in the preterist school, they have the best credentials. Most academic scholars are preterists to some degree or other. And again, the focus, Roman Empire, and an interest in the Emperor Nero. On the futurist side, few if any, maybe there are a few, academic scholars are futurists. Their interest is the Middle East, used to be communism, and the Battle of Armageddon is a literal battle in the Middle East. And then the historicist, few scholars today are historicists. Seventh-day Adventist interpreters defend historicist tenets. It is actually seen as a badge of honor to be a historicist and a criterion for orthodoxy as well. And in the historicist view, you have all of history, but you have a particular interest in church history, Roman Catholic Church, Protestantism, leading down to our time. Obviously, very different horizons. Obviously, the choice of school, if you were to make a choice, will determine where you land. And so we need to be very circumspect before we commit to any of these. Well, what do they offer? Let's do a little more of a close-up, especially on the preterist school, since that may not be familiar to many of those who look at these videos. So the history lesson in the preterist school begins with the Roman Empire, and especially with the figure of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a general, he was a politician, he was a writer, a very good writer, he was a very charismatic figure, a kind of Kennedy-like figure, and a successful general. He marched across the Rubicon, you've heard it, and he marches on Rome, and he becomes emperor. And this is seen as treason by the Senate in Rome, because the Roman Empire used to be a republic, not led by an autocratic emperor. So this was seen as treason. And Julius Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Senate in 44 BC, and ostensibly to restore the republic. So what happened? Well, what happened is the work of this man, Augustus, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And immediately when Caesar had been assassinated, he said that Caesar was not a traitor, he was a hero, he was a martyr. So he saves the reputation of Julius Caesar, and he becomes emperor himself in a very clever way. First, under the image of Augustus as a great soldier who subdues his competition and becomes emperor in 27 BC, and later more as a priestly figure, a father figure, who is a sort of benign figure. And very cleverly, Augustus pretends that we are still a republic. He is an emperor. His word is the final word. There is no law given that will not be Augustus' law. But he pretends to maintain, he maintains the semblance of republic, and is very clever in that way. So this is this time, and it is interesting history. Whether or not this history is reflected in the book of Revelation, it's sort of something that ought to be common knowledge. Now, we owe to the preterist a bit of myth busting about the time of Revelation. So the thinking in most communities, regardless of school of interpretation, is that the book of Revelation was written during the days of Domitian. And Domitian's dates are 81 to 96. And somewhere in here, John is on Patmos, and he receives the revelation that we are reading. And so this is time of Domitian. And Domitian was a great builder. This is an arch here in Asia Minor. This is the Domitian hippodrome of sorts in Rome. These are coins with Domitian's image. And this face here used to be the face of Domitian, but those who toppled him, eventually he was toppled. And there was a kind of what they call in Latin damnatio memoria, that you damn the memory of the previous emperor, you try to erase him. So the head of Domitian was replaced by the head of Nerva, who was the general that took over when Domitian was assassinated in 96. But for readers of Revelation, this is the trick. It used to be said that Domitian was a great persecutor of Christians, and that simply isn't true. Domitian's negative reputation in so many ways was shaped by those who wrote history during the time of his successors, and they did everything they could to darken his memory, to malign his memory, and so on. And so was there a lot of persecution during the time of Domitian, as Revelation scholars, Revelation readings have generally held? Not really, not so. It's more complicated. Well, what about Nero? Since the preterists think that Nero is a major figure in the book of Revelation. So let's do a little Nero. His dates are 54 to 68, that's AD. That's the time of the Apostle Paul. And most likely the Apostle Paul perished in Rome during the time of Nero. That is at least a very plausible reconstruction. Nero was the adopted son of the Emperor Claudius, and the Emperor Claudius is a direct descendant of Julius Caesar. So he is a Julian emperor. And not a great emperor maybe, but this is, he adopts Nero. He adopts Nero because he married the mother. He married Agrippina, who was the mother of Nero. And here is Agrippina depicted with Nero, with her son, in an amicable relationship with her son. And here is Nero with Britannicus. Britannicus is Claudius' blood son, his real descendant. Nero is not the son of Claudius, Britannicus is. So here is a depiction found in Asia Minor of Nero in a friendly relationship with Britannicus. Well, here is the true story. So what will Nero do? Nero will arrange to assassinate his adopted father Claudius. He will, in an extremely cruel way, arrange to murder his mother, Agrippina. And he arranges to murder Britannicus. And he murders his wife. He has a pretty devastating track record. He is his reputation is deservedly very, very bad. And yet he is seen as a figure in Revelation. He is seen as the beast in Revelation 13. There is a wound in that beast, and the wound is healed. And this, preterist scholars will say, points to the myth of the return of the Emperor Nero, the resurrection of the Emperor Nero. Most preterist readings are extremely sure about that. Many of you who are familiar with the book of Revelation have never heard it. But there are books and books and books, reams of books about this and the role of Nero in the Revelation. So we have in the Roman times a Roman myth or a myth construct, and it's the myth of the Pax Romana. This is the arch of the Emperor Septimius Severus, who was a North African emperor in Rome in the 3rd century. But there are several arches, triumphal arches, and they are symbols of Roman power. And then we have this altar. That's the altar of peace, built in honor of the Emperor Augustus for his achievement to bring peace and stability to the Roman world. And then we have a detail here from the altar of peace, a woman with children, and everything is peaceful, everything is prosperous. So we have prosperity, we have peace and stability, and we have power. Power, peace and stability and prosperity. Those are the gifts of the Roman Empire to the world. Is it true? Is it true? That's the thing. That's the myth. And the myth has a religious tenor. These symbols evoke religion. God has done something in Roman times. God has bestowed his blessing on the world. And this altar is a religious symbol, of course. And here, this is an image of the Emperor Lucius Verus, who ruled as a contemporary with Marcus Aurelius toward the end of the 2nd century. Here, what is happening here? Lucius Verus is going to heaven, and he is accompanied by an angel, and he will be installed in heaven not as a god exactly, but as a divinized figure. The Senate in Rome will vote divine honors for Lucius Verus. So the religious tenor of the Roman Empire is indisputable. Providence is at work. God is at work in the world, and the Roman Empire is a blessing to humans and a blessing from God. And here is Paul Sanker, a statement, and my illustration again is Lucius Verus. This one you can see in Vienna, his ascent to heaven. And here is what Paul Sanker will say. Most importantly, through visual imagery, a new mythology of Rome, and for the emperor, a new ritual of power were created. Built on relatively simple foundation, the myth perpetuated itself and transcended the realities of everyday life to project onto future generations the impression that they lived in the best of all possible worlds in the best of all times. That's how it is. That's how you feel when you are a Roman citizen, or don't you? That's the question. Is it myth? Is this a Roman myth, a kind of religious, political myth? This myth of Pax Romana, with power here, with peace and stability, underwritten by religious symbols. And then here is something that is a little different. This is the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, long ruling. This was at the time when the Roman Empire was at its largest in extent, and lots of monuments were built. And I have seen this image. It's in the museum in Istanbul. And what do you see here? The foot of Hadrian is placed on the neck of a conquered subject. The Roman myth is peace and prosperity. The Roman reality is oppression, based on military power and based on the socioeconomic advantages of slavery, because 1/2 to 1/3 of the Roman population are slaves. So this is decidedly a myth, and this is a reality that the myth does not show you, in a sense, except, of course, they do take some pleasure in showing their power. That's true. So there is a value here. I want to say this as a value. As much as I think preterism is inadequate, and it is inadequate, there is still a value by exposing certain things, such as the persistence and temptation of national myths, what they project and what they hide. Those are the issues. And I just want to go to our time and look for a second on why this is, how this might apply to our time, and how preterist readers of Revelation actually see it. Because I have learned this partly by reading history and partly by listening to what the preterist readers say. And I have visited Mount Rushmore with my family when our kids were small. And this is George Washington, and this is Thomas Jefferson. I'm not exactly sure how Teddy Roosevelt made it into this, but he did. And this is Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, preceded Teddy Roosevelt as a president. And there is George Washington on horseback, and he's a very noble figure. And here is the Jefferson Monument in Washington, D.C. And by the way, it looks like the Pantheon in Rome. The buildings are similar. What counts as grand in our time counted as grand in Roman times too. And then, of course, here is another one. What achievements, what marvels. Traveling to the moon, planting your flag on the moon. It's amazing. But it is in some ways part of a national myth. And the reality that the myth projects, or aspects of reality, are not projected by the myth. So there is a fallacy in our myth too, things that are hidden. Just as the Romans did not like to say that they are a slave-based society, we have not liked to admit that the component of slavery in the sort of building up of our self-image, self-understanding in our time. And I highly, highly recommend a book by Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told. The Half has never been told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Just to drive the point home. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. George Washington was a slaveholder in a significant way. Thomas Jefferson was in a big way and fathered many children with one of his slaves in a highly unequal relationship, and a relationship only acknowledged much later. And so just to try to set this straight, the New York Times in 2019 launched this 1619 project. It is extremely controversial in our time. An attempt to admit to the role of slavery in the building up of the New World, and the dislike to acknowledge that history. So just as we speak, that is very controversial, but the content of the 1619 project is pretty solid. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the British colony of Virginia. A slave ship, just around the same time as the Pilgrims had arrived and as the nation was founded. So beware of the national myths. Beware of stories that go like this, and we could then read Paul Sanker again by thinking of our own time and thinking of our own ideals. Some of them very good, some of them not so good, some of them absolutely, in some ways, quite despicable. So, most importantly, through visual imagery, a new mythology of Rome and for the emperor a new ritual of power were created, built on relatively simple foundations. The myth perpetuated itself and transcended the realities of everyday life to project onto future generations the impression that they lived in the best of all possible worlds in the best of all times. Our time, our country, that is the possibility. And yes, this is a critique offered of contemporary realities from the perspective of preterism and its reading of the book of Revelation. And maybe there is something of value there. I had planned not to say much about futurism. I'm actually quite what should I say? I do not think futurism deserves that much of a comment, but it has a huge market share in America in particular. So some tenets of futurism is that Revelation talks about our time, 20th century, 21st century. The number 666 is a tattoo to be put on the forehead in a literal sense. The Battle of Armageddon is a conflict over oil in the Middle East. That was the most recent take on that one. Maybe less plausible now, because we are getting green energy and oil is not as much of an issue anymore. So some of these claims of the futurists are quite short-lived. I think this one is more serious. This is a critique written by Robert Jewett, one of the great scholars of our time, especially a great scholar of Rome, of the Paul and the letter to the Romans. He says that these futurist attitudes, they are attitudes that are resistant to federal authority, hostile to the traditional American politics of compromise, rejecting government controls over the banking and business systems, and profoundly suspicious of international law and peacekeeping. This is how futurist readings actually influences contemporary politics. And yes, there are quite a few members of Congress, in the US Congress, who subscribe to futurist readings of the book of Revelation. So that's all I will say about futurism. And I will not say much about historicism now, just give a very brief overview. So what does historicism offer? It looks at a bigger picture. So this is history from the time of John until the time of the end, with a perception that the time of the end is not far away. So the historicist reader has his eye on the watch, has his eye on the calendar, on the clock, that the time is running out, we're almost home, we're almost there. And a very important tenet in historicism is that the book of Revelation is like the second volume of the book of Daniel, that the paradigm of a history-centered reading is given to us from the book of Daniel, and Revelation takes it over and adds to it as a kind of more, almost like a second volume or an update on Daniel. And then, as I mentioned already, there is a focus on history, but it is mostly church history, and especially Roman Catholic Church and Protestantism. The role of the Roman Empire, the role of Nero that you have in the preterist, the paradigm is in the historicist paradigm in some ways occupied by the Roman Catholic Church and contending with other issues that Protestant theology gives us. And then historicism is also has in common with the futurist that there is a focus on the time of the reader, the time of the historicist reader. The interpreter tends to find himself and herself in the story. Yes, there is this happened, but it is what is happening now that counts, and Revelation illuminates, in that sense, our time. So that's the historicist paradigm. What are flaws or what are limitations here of these schools of interpretation? I may even say, where do they fall short? So my illustration here is a clock. It could have been a calendar. And here is what I mean by that illustration. All these interpretations are time and event centered. Indisputable that they have that in common, as divergent or as different as they are. And yes, all demand a type of expertise that is rarely achievable for the ordinary person. If you have to read all that all that preterist curriculum, that is not for the ordinary person. If you have to read the historicist curriculum, it takes a little work to do that. So that type of expertise is rarely achievable for ordinary readers. And so my third point, there will be a line of demarcation between the expert and the lay reader. We understand Revelation. We don't understand Revelation, but someone in our community understands it for us. We understand Revelation in my faith community because we have some experts, and they understand Revelation vicariously for me. So I believe that my community understands the book of Revelation, even though most of us in that community don't. We just count on our experts to have gotten it right. I don't feel that I'm exaggerating there. And there is a kind of silo shape, communal silos here. You have the silo of the preterist and the silo of the futurist and the silo of the historicist. And it's not wrong to call them silos. They are even silos in the sense that the preterists hardly know anything about what the historicists teach, and vice versa. They hardly know about the existence of the other community, in fact, and many of the things I have said in this presentation will be new to people who belong to one community or another. We have separate approaches and separate communities. For some communities, the futurists and the historicists in particular, the interpretation is a major element in that community's sense of identity. That's how we define ourselves. Those are critical beliefs, how we look at the world and how we read the book of Revelation. And yes, each community knows little about the other communities and might like to keep it that way, because if your perspective is challenged by something in the other perspective, that could be unsettling in some ways. So this is a problem then. When I talk about these approaches to Revelation, this is a problem. It might just be a deterrent for people to say, well, I want to go to the University of Revelation, or to the universe of Revelation, to the world of Revelation. I'd like to know what's there. But you have to have these admission requirements. The preterist requirement, the futurist requirement, the historicist requirement, that as you enter, you sort of have to commit to those different schools. And that perspective is in place before you start reading. So they will say, this is how you should read it, preterist. This is how you should read it, historicist. And that could be a deterrent. It could even be a mistake. So let's just look at it, take a step back from these schools and look at the book itself and the type of claims we have in the book. John on Patmos, who is identified by name in the book of Revelation, I, John, he is a reader. He is not only a seer. He is a reader and a seer. And the text he has read is not the history of the Roman Empire or the history of the world or the history of 21st or 20th, 21st century as in futurism. The text he has read is the Old Testament. The text he has read is the Bible. And he has not only read the book of Daniel, even though he has read that too. He has read Genesis and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah and Job, and he has immense command of what he has read. So when we try to look at, to visualize sort of how he works, how he puts this together, how his being a reader and a seer works in practice. We see him here at his desk, and he is told to write. There is a command to write, and write he will do. But he doesn't use the Old Testament that way, the way I put it here. So I have to put a question mark next to him. It's not how he works. He has it all stored in his head. It is as though the distance between his head and his hand is obliterated. He writes with he thinks with his hand. That's what someone has said, and I will read that statement, what someone has said. So let's do this again. He's a reader. His text is the Old Testament. He's a seer. What he sees is related to what he has read. He is in some ways aware that he might be writing the climax of history, as Richard Bauckham puts it. The book that will, in some ways, complete the Bible, that begins in Genesis and will end in the book of Revelation. And he writes with amazing command of that text. His subject is theology more than history. His subject is God more than events, and how God's reputation and how God's battle against evil will be brought to a successful conclusion. So Austin Farrer, who was a great and imaginative British scholar, some say he was the greatest New Testament scholar in Britain in the 20th century, he wrote a couple of books on Revelation, and I'd like to read what he says about the way John works. No other New Testament author felt himself called to the same task. No other set himself to capture a visionary experience of the last things, and here is a key, by intense and systematic meditation on the whole prophetic tradition. That's John as a reader. So far from reading like an attempt to communicate a previous visionary experience, the Revelation reads like a fresh and continuous scriptural meditation, conceived in the very words in which it was written down, as though, in fact, the author was thinking with his pen. Amazing. A feat not all out of the way, for have we not all done it from time to time, perhaps when we were writing a familiar letter, and thinking no faster than we wrote. That is an excellent view of John, I think. And here is Richard Bauckham, who was one of my mentors at the University of St. Andrews and who has been a prolific contributor to many current issues in the New Testament, and his work on Revelation is quoted again and again. And this is his view, and I agree 100% with it. John was writing what he understood to be a work of apocalyptic scripture, the climax of prophetic revelation, which gathered up the prophetic meaning of the Old Testament scriptures and disclosed the way in which it was being and was to be fulfilled in the last days. It's hard to improve on that statement, in my view. So this means that the time-centeredness of readings of Revelation, preterist, futurist, historicist, they constrain our horizon ill-advisedly. It's not all about time. There is past, present, and future. And past, not just back to the time of John, but all the way back to the time of creation, all the way back to the time before creation, in God's time, as it were. And the focus is human and cosmic reality. Human, that's history, but cosmic, that's theology. That's beyond historical events. So there is a spatial issue there, not just a temporal issue that is bigger. And Revelation is more interested in values than in events. If we understand Revelation's values. We will have a tool. We will have criteria with which to assess events that will be superior to any event-centered approach, looking to the past, looking to the future, a sort of comprehensive view here. That's what my illustration is meant to show. And the arrow all the way back to primordial time and all the way forward to the world made new. That's Revelation's horizon. Finally, a note on who is who in the book of Revelation, because that is also in some ways obscured in readings. There is a tendency, yes, there is God, and there is human reality here in this corner, and there is a non-human reality depicted in Revelation, angelic reality, demonic reality, that is important in Revelation's story. Who is who in interpretations of Revelation? Well, mostly God and mostly the human side. Very much the case in the preterist paradigm and also in the others to some extent, to the exclusion of the non-human element, the cosmic element that is so important for Revelation's explanation. So we have the cosmic perspective lost, and when I came to St. Andrews, I wanted to read back into the story the cosmic perspective of Revelation, and eventually I won some support for that from my excellent mentors. Okay, let's do some conclusions here. The time and event-centered approaches of the leading schools, they impose a straitjacket on Revelation that mutes the book's authentic voice and limits access. It is a deterrent to reading this book, and in quite a few church traditions, Revelation doesn't have much of a role. God, not events or a timeline, is the main concern in the book. To reveal God's name and to inscribe God's name is the book's unswerving purpose. And some specifics. The preterist focus on Roman imperial reality and its critique of national myths are, in my view, matters of value for all readers, even though those readings are not adequate for the story in Revelation. They might still be matters of value. Futurist readings are unmoored and speculative. They tend to affirm the prejudices and political bias of the underlying God and country belief system in large swaths of Christian America. They are not helpful readings of the book of Revelation. Historicist readings have lost appeal because of the passage of time beyond what interpreters led people to expect, and this is my main critique, and deservedly, by prioritizing history over theology, events over theology over God. And then the final point, Revelation does not submit to the constraints of the schools. It refuses to stay inbound in its resolve to reveal God and save God's reputation. Welcome to the third presentation in our series, Rereading Revelation.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting video. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. I'm proposing that we take a brief break. It's 11:20 on the East Coast, so let's meet at 11:30 in about 10 minutes. And I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions for Sigve, who is graciously with us, even though he is far away. And consider what your questions may be. Raise your hand. Monty is going to be the person who is going to moderate your questions and discussions. and I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you. So welcome back from our break. We are discussing the Book of Revelation with Sigve Tonstad. And we have listened to a very interesting perspective. So I saw a comment by you, Sigve. Could you please tell us a little bit more about this idealist perspective that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, hello everyone. I'm very privileged to participate in this group. I have been in the class in person and benefited a lot from it, and I'm very happy that you are continuing the class. I think there is a place for that, and to continue that legacy of Roy Branson and Dave Larson. So I did not give time to the so-called idealist perspective in my presentation, because it is not a view held by many scholars. Actually, I would almost be hard pressed to see who they would be, but I think there are some names whose view could be called idealist, and that means that they are more general. They are not as time specific. You know, the preterist view is very time specific, very event specific, and likewise the historicist view very, very specific. And idealists think that these schools have have oversold their hand. They have promised more than they can keep, that the symbols in some ways exceed those specific applications. And some people think that some of my, maybe I should call them critics in the Adventist community, think that my perspective is idealist. And I do not agree with that, because I think I do not find the so-called idealist school to be very interested in the cosmic perspective and in the way the story of evil is narrated in the book of Revelation. I do not find that to be a major concern in the idealist. But there is an idealist perspective, but there is, I think we should acknowledge, there is an idealist school of interpretation. It is not by any means as large as the preterists among academics, and it is a smaller view, but maybe it is gaining a little lately. If anyone wants to call my approach anything, they should think in terms of cosmic conflict. But I do not want to say that we should read Revelation as members of a school of interpretation. We should read this book as people who are enamored by a text and think that we could really learn something good from it and study it. And the schools are a secondary matter.
Thank you, Sigve. So do you take any elements from these schools that you presented in the way how you understand the revelation?
Yes, yes, of course, because there on many levels, you know. I will make an exception for the futurist. I cannot really see any merit to futurism, even though that is this school or the reading that has the most market share in the US, especially. That I think that is a bit out in the left field. But all of these other, I mean, the preterist, the scholars in the preterist school are excellent readers of text. They read the text of Revelation. They read, you know, background issues, textual background, textual meanings. They can do something very good for us there. And then when it comes to application, you can learn things there too, as I mentioned, that preterist reading, that is, you might call it a critique of empire, critique of national myths, critique of constellations where religion and politics flow together. Those are very strong elements in preterism, and I think those are very that the preterists give us a valid way of seeing political realities, even though I think they constrain the text of Revelation. That the text Revelation is up to even bigger things than they envision. But I recommend reading those interpreters, and from the historicists, there are things of value too. I would say the traditional Adventist historicism of someone like Uriah Smith is very strong on religious liberty. It's not necessarily argued completely cogently from the text of Revelation, but it is a conviction of the interpreter, of someone like Uriah Smith, and I value that. I honor that. I think that is something that is respectable.
So in a way, wouldn't you say that the critique of national myths by preterists is in a way critique of the futurist view as well?
I think that's a very, yes, I haven't thought of it that way actually, but when you say it, I think I totally agree with you. That's totally, they are very much opposites in what they see happening in the text there, and in some ways you could say that the futurists are just lost at sea, because they don't see that, what that emphasis that preterists see so well, they don't see it at all.
Thank you very much. And Monty, can you please now get on with the questions? We have several hands raised, and Carol and McKinley also indicated they want to speak.
Yes, thank you. And I've talked with several people in chat, and I see that Peter has also raised his hand. I've noticed you. So first, before we get started, I want to remind people of discussion guidelines. Please limit yourself to 1 point or question per time in the queue, so I don't have to limit you. If you have 2 or more points to make, share your first point. This will give us an opportunity to focus on that point or question. And then you can ask to be put back into the queue for your second or third point or question. My priorities in the queue will be on first points or questions and on gender balance in the queue order. And with that, I am going to go to McKinley.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Dr. Tonstad, thank you very much for your deep research into the book of Revelation. I watched the introductory video and was intrigued by how long you've had an interest in the book of Revelation, from your adolescent years through high school, college, your doctoral work, and now this series. One question from your introductory talk resonated with me before I make my comment here. Forgive me, Monty, very quickly. And it is this. You said, seeing the book of Revelation from a healing perspective, how is it that a world in need of healing misses the vision and remedy of healing that the book of Revelation embodies? Now, here's my comment. For research robustness, I think it is productive to understand and compare the approaches to reading Revelation. And when undertaken, I have found the classical Adventist approach to reading Revelation survives scrutiny although it can and should be improved upon. One reason for this outcome is that it's backed up by observation and its application is broad. At the same time, questions about its prophetic emphasis should be explored, as your talk suggests, and new ways of thinking about Revelation should be entertained. Partly as a result of this class's exploration of the different approaches to Revelation, my own rethinking arrives at the following points. Revelation is a reiteration of the gospel. Genesis introduces the gospel. Jesus' ministry confirms the gospel. Revelation reaffirms the gospel. For example, in rethinking Revelation, in the messages to the 7 churches broadly applied, the following emerge: a focus on Christ, God with us, God's concern for the well-being of the church, exhortation to self-reflection, exhortation to persevere, exhortation to pay attention to the messages. So why do you think researchers and scholars of the schools that you've shared today miss this big picture about God?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you have mentioned several very relevant and interesting observations from your reading. So there is also a terminological issue here, because you say the revelation affirms the gospel, and it preaches the gospel and so on. And I don't disagree with that, but I would like to make it more specific. There is a certain concern in Revelation about my dissertation, if I may say that. I tried to capture what I believe is the concern of Revelation when I called my dissertation "Saving God's Reputation," that there is a reputational issue, a perception issue of God, God himself, and that Revelation is aware of that. The Revelation is inside the text thinking that God has a problem. And so to solve the problem that God has in the text of Revelation, and then I try to put a name to what that problem is. God has a reputational problem because there is perceptions about what God will be doing. So I think one can specify then more what the gospel is in some ways in the context of Revelation, because in theological terms, everyone knows what the gospel is, but that may not be exactly relevant or cover what is going on in Revelation. So to the main thing that you mentioned, why do I think that these readers, these schools of interpretation, tend to miss the vision of healing in Revelation? And I think the main reason for that is because they do not have a cosmic perspective. They do not understand the reality of evil, and they read texts that are violent, that seem to be just atrocious things that happen, calamities that happen, and they ascribe those violent things to God. And I think that ruins the theology of Revelation. Revelation becomes the problem in theology rather than the solution to the problem that Revelation wishes to solve. So maybe the most important thing in my comment to what you mentioned is that the cosmic perspective, if that is lost, then Revelation's horizon contracts, and you will ascribe to God things that are revelatory of the evil side in the cosmic conflict.
Thank you very much. Thank you, McKinley, for getting us started. Let's go to Carol.
Thank you. It seems like the more I learn about history, the more it seems to me that the history of the world is based on lies. And this was really an illuminating idea to me in your Revelation commentary that focuses a great deal on the idea of the big lie. I think you just kind of touched on it in your previous comment. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah. Well, the tools of the opposing side in the cosmic conflict is to misrepresent God. And when you get to the middle of Revelation, they talk about slandering God. That is the verb there for slander. It's actually the word from which we have the word to blaspheme or or blasphemy. But the essential meaning of that is to slander someone, to misrepresent someone. And then, so that is at the heart of the cosmic conflict. I think it is also very featured in the Gospel of John. I see John Jones here, so I have to say something about the Gospel of John because I learned so much from him in that Gospel. But in John 8:44, when Jesus talks to his critics and he calls his cosmic opponent a liar and the father of the lie, and it is almost like the lie in this way of thinking, and certainly in the Gospel of John, that the lie can be identified, can be pinpointed as the misrepresentation of God that you have in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, and I tend to think of it that way. So I think that is very much at a central issue here, the way lies work, the way one builds up all kinds of myths. And the most successful lie and the most consequential lie then would be the lie that we have in the Bible, the way God is represented by his opponent. That I think we cannot exaggerate the importance of that. That is huge.
Thank you, Carol. Next, Rod.
Thank you, Sigve. I come from a large family, and the three silos that you have presented, I see members of my family and relatives in all of them, and sometimes they move across them and have no understanding that they have moved from one silo to another silo. What I don't want to do for myself in this exercise is end up putting myself in a silo or building a silo. I think that the problem that I face is that with Adventist historicity is how devout my relatives are on this subject matter, that they were offered a perspective in Australia before Des Ford's time from earlier evangelists. And some of them feel they've had to give up something in their Adventist beliefs, but they are just fundamental and devout on, can't give up anything on my understanding through childhood on this matter of revelation. So I'm wondering how you stage a conversation, if you can, with somebody who is a fundamentalist and has loved and adored and become and cherished their earliest beliefs. And I don't know how to mount that, but I do believe what you just addressed in terms of the cosmic conflict framework, that has to be one key element of your discussion with anybody, and maybe everybody, that might question you or want to talk about this subject matter. I think the cosmic conflict underpins so much, and I thank you for your contribution to my thinking on this matter. But can you just share 2 or 3 points of how you would frame a discussion as to what's most important in building or reshaping somebody else's perspective when they dearly love what they've believed all their lives?
Well, thank you very much. I think you raise very, very important questions, and also, questions that affect our relationships and our sense of identity as a church. There are many things there. So toward the end of that video that we looked at, I was presenting John as a reader, that he was reading, and he as a seer. He is a reader and he is a seer, and when he writes his own text, his reading shows. You can tell that he has been reading, that he is someone who is, thinking with his pen, as Austin Farrer says. And in the sort of earliest iteration of Adventist historicism, like Uriah Smith, and maybe even to some extent William Miller, or I think you can put them all together, they thought that John was a seer, but they did not treat him as a reader. There is almost no awareness or no sense. Yes, you can say that Uriah Smith knows that Revelation is related to the book of Daniel, so I give him that. But all the other voices, Old Testament voices that we hear in Revelation, they go missing in the earliest iteration of Adventist historicism. They are not found. Let's say that the text that is so important in Adventism, and I think it is echoed in Revelation, Isaiah 14, the star that has fallen from heaven to earth and that wreaks havoc on earth. You think that maybe Uriah Smith would mention that text when he gets to Revelation, the trumpets in Revelation, where there is a star that has fallen from heaven and opens the abyss and there is a smoke coming out. He could mention it there, or he could mention it in relation to the beginning of the cosmic war in Revelation 12. But Uriah Smith doesn't mention Isaiah 14 at all, not at all, because he does not think that John was a reader. He is in some ways oblivious to John's literary sensibilities and maybe also theological sensibilities. So I think one could maybe move the needle a little in those more traditional historicist readings by showing the deficit, the lack, the absence of that awareness of John as a reader. Now, the historicist defenders in Adventism today, they have moved away from Uriah Smith, and beginning with La Rondelle and others at the theological seminary, they do recognize that John was a reader and that he uses the Old Testament. But in that is an improvement. Methodologically, that is an improvement. But theologically, it isn't helping very much, because they tend to say that some things that, in my view of Revelation, should be ascribed to the evil forces, to the bad side, they will assign to God. So you will have, in that version of historicism, a much stronger emphasis on retribution than you find in Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith is not very interested in theology, he's interested in history. But the new school, the new historicist people in Adventism are interested in theology too. And in my view, I'm sorry to put it this way, but in my view, they make the theology even worse, because that way of ascribing to God what should be ascribed to the evil one destroys the message of Revelation. So they have improved something there methodologically, and I acknowledge that. But I think that we have to just, to find a way to show John to be a reader also and a thinker, and then see how he puts these things together and how he uses all these texts, and some of them he uses them over and over, and of course when he calls the devil, the diabolos, or Satanas, when he calls him the adversary and the mudslinger and the ancient serpent, of course he is thinking about the lie in Genesis, the ancient serpent. You cannot miss that. You cannot say a term like that and not think of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, of course, so I think there is so much sincerity in the Adventist community that I think we could make progress. There is also respect for the Bible. So I think we could make progress because I really don't propose to say much that isn't, that cannot in some ways be defended by the text, so I see myself engaged in a very textual project, as it were.
Yes, thank you, Sigve. The attention span of some of my relatives is very short, and I have to think of a way of approaching it that will get them off the tractors and in around a table for at least a few minutes. But it's very difficult to hook the devotees.
I believe in you.
All right, thank you very much. Ed, you're up.
Yes, thank you, Sigve, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate it. I wonder if you could just say a few words about the early struggle of the church, whether to include or not include Revelation in the canon. As I understand it, my area is not historical theology. There are early canons that did not have the book of Revelation, and some did include. What were the specific issues?
Well, I am not an expert on the way the canon was came into being, but I do think that there are sort of models for understanding, what led to canonization, why did these books end up in the canon, and it may be true that the book of Revelation was not, was vulnerable or could have been left out. I don't know that there is specific knowledge about those processes, but I have read a book about the Roman Catholic Church by John Mackenzie that I was assigned by Paul Landa when I took a class on the Roman Catholic Church at the Loma La Sierra many years ago. And John Mackenzie, he delineates the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism in relation to Scripture. And he would put it this way, that in the Catholic paradigm, the church gives us the Bible. That is the Catholic understanding, that there is a center of authority that sits and adjudicates which books should be in the canon. And we know that some apocryphal books have been included in a Catholic canon that are not considered canonical by Protestants. And then the Protestant paradigm is that It was the Bible that gave us the church. So there is priority of scripture over church authority. And then that would mean that the canonizing the books of the Bible would not be something that was, fundamentally adjudicated by some church authority. It was the books themselves that commended themselves to readers and eventually came to be regarded as canonical. Luther did not think that the Revelation, early on, Luther did not think that Revelation should be in the canon. And Zwingli thought the same way. He was very contemptuous of the book of Revelation. John Calvin was so contemptuous toward it that he hardly mentions it at all. But they are not the ones who decide on whether these books should be in the canon in the beginning. So in my paradigm for these books is that the book of Revelation, whatever its status may have been at some point, and I think that there is not that much specific evidence. Maybe someone else in the group can say more about this than I can. But on this subject, I would be a Protestant who will not say that some committee, some church authority, some pope, they decided this is what we will consider the canon. That decision was in some ways imposed on us by the quality of the books themselves. They simply had staying power. Even some people who are critical of the Gnostic Gospels, and I have read some things about the Gnostic Gospels that were competing versions of the life of Christ that are very, very old. But one person has said that the Gnostic Gospels didn't make it. They didn't make the cut because those who wrote those Gospels couldn't think. The quality, they failed the test of inclusion by their poor quality in some ways. I hope that is helpful. I think that you deserve in some ways a better answer than I can give because I have, of course, related to the book of Revelation as a canonical book, and as the canon appears today, the amazing symmetry between the first two chapters of Genesis and the last two chapters of the book of Revelation is quite spectacular. It's quite amazing.
Okay, thank you. I have several people added to the queue. I've got an iPhone and Alicia. Next, we go to Peter, though.
Peter, please unmute.
I understood that Alicia is going to be first.
Well, actually, I don't. We can go there. Alicia.
I was wondering if Revelation uses any other sources besides the Old Testament or alludes to other works.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and the answer is, of course, there must be many elements that show awareness of historical realities of its own time, so there is representation of secular history in some ways that is contemporary. But as far as texts go, to what extent does Revelation use textual material that isn't part of the Old Testament canon? And there is one text that I think that is quite unambiguous. That is in Revelation 14:20. where the wine press is trod outside the city. We read that the wine press was trodden outside the city, and blood rose from the wine press as high as the bridles of the horses for a distance of 1,600 stadia. That is a very bizarre text. You know, all this blood rising to the bridles of the horses from Loma Linda to San Diego. You know, that's the distance that we have there. There is an enormous bloodbath. So is there an Old Testament, a text outside the Bible that you can find echoing there? And there is one from First Enoch, which is a non-canonical apocalypse that talks about blood rising to the bridles of the horses. And it also describes a battle scene where people turn on each other, where the father kills the son and they kill the grandson for the same price. And there is bloodshed, there is dissolution in the ranks of the army that is fighting God. And I think it is it's a striking text, and it is a text that has theological meaning because it shows how evil implodes. And I think that would be one example of how how John is aware of other texts that are not canonical Old Testament texts.
Thank you.
I've got two first questions coming up, and then Carol, unless we get another first questioner coming up. So Peter.
Thank you, Sigve, for your challenging presentation. I have a few comments to make. I will start only with the first one. When you talked about preterism, you mentioned that during the Emperor Domitian, there was not too much religious persecution. And some historians are arguing. Well, I agree with you that was not a severe religious persecution, but was a persecution nonetheless. There are 10 waves of persecution in the history of Christianity until Christianity was made official religion during Constantine, and then the official religion of the empire during Theodosius. There are 3 waves of severe religious persecution that I agree with and are mentioned by many historians. And that will be during Nero, related to the fire in Rome. The second one, that will be, Nero died in 68. That will be AD. That the second one will be during Emperor Decius in 251. And the third one will be at the end of the 3rd century during the Emperor Diocletian. That will be the first comment, and I have a few others.
All right, and I will put you back. I have you on the queue already, Peter. Sigve, do you have a response to Peter, or shall we?
No, I think, I want to affirm what he's saying, that those emperors, Nero, sure, and Decius and Diocletian, are on record as instigators of persecution of Christians. And we are not saying, people are not saying about Domitian that, was there persecution during Domitian? There may have been some persecution during Domitian. There is in the text of Revelation, in some of the churches, that someone was killed. There might Antipas, my faithful witness, he was killed in the city of Pergamum. So you can say that there are incidents of persecution in the text of Revelation too, but and this is due to the work of a very outstanding scholar, historian, and Revelation scholar by the name of Leonard Thompson, who has written a book called Apocalypse and Empire. And I think that's the title of his book. And he has won the argument very much here that there was a tendency in Roman historiography, the way Roman historians wrote history. They were hirelings. They wrote history to make the present time look great and to make the past look bad. So those people who wrote history during the reign of Trajan, just after the time of Domitian, they wanted to make him look as bad as they possibly could and make their own emperor look as good as they could. So they were not neutral historians. They were spin doctors in some ways, and they spun a negative tale about Domitian. So we don't need to say that there was no persecution during the time of Domitian, but we need to say that his reputation has in some ways been unfairly characterized. That's what Leonard Thompson would have said. So I think we should be open to that corrective, and still then we're not saying that there was no persecution at all during that time.
All right, thank you, Peter, for helping highlight that issue. And I do have you back on the queue, so we'll come back to Peter in a bit. Next up, we have Eduardo. First question.
Thank you. Sigve, I watched the video last night, the lecture of the lady, and I have seen others about Revelation. And how come having the same revelation, the Protestant churches, even the Catholics, come to different interpretation? And let me try to put something on the chat so I can make my comment. Let me see. This is Sister Huay. The paragraph is longer than this. She say they knew that when not in vision, I could not understand these matters, and they accept as light direct from heaven the revelation given me. Thus, the leading points of our faith, as we hold them today, are firmly established. Point after point was clearly defined, and all the brethren came into harmony. And my question to you, and I have listened to several scholars about the source of our doctrines are not coming from Sister Huay, and they go one by one. But when you read this statement, it seems the opposite. So the understanding for the church is coming through revelation. And my question to you is, do you think that you will have an Adventist interpretation without the spirit of prophecy? And remember the disciples, they have the Old Testament, even Paul. They didn't understand the prophecies. They have it on their hands, but their interpretation or their understanding, they don't have it. Could we have the Adventist message without Ellen G. White revelations or visions? What is your answer? Because it's a lot of confusion on the interpretation of Revelation.
Well, and those are legitimate questions, and they are very important questions in relation to the Book of Revelation, because the Book of Revelation for Adventists is a book that confers a sense of identity and has conferred a sense of identity on Adventists. So and the subject is too big to talk about it exhaustively here, but I think I could say one or two things about it. So I think the role of Ellen G. White in the way our theology has been laid out, and things she has affirmed and some things she has disaffirmed, I think her role is enormous. And that the cosmic conflict perspective in her writings, there is no book in the Bible that confers legitimacy on that perspective more than the Book of Revelation. So in that sense, for taking a sort of cosmic conflict approach to reality, Ellen G. White and the Book of Revelation would be quite overlap, or they have similar horizons. But when it comes to the tendency of Adventists to wish to make Ellen G. White the final word on many interpretations of specific texts in the Book of Revelation, I think that is a misuse of her writings. They were at a certain phase of development in their time and had limited resources with which to do specific, works on what should I say, exegesis of Bible texts. And I mentioned earlier that Miller and certainly Uriah Smith, they did not see John on Patmos as a reader. They did not respect him as the reader that he was. They treated him as a seer mostly. And that is a flawed perception of the kind of work he did and the kind of book he wrote. So my sort of in conclusion to your question is, yes, I would say that we are in territory where we can strongly affirm the importance and the contribution of Ellen G. White, but not as the final word. We cannot do that. There is much more in the text, and I could come up with lots of Ellen G. White quotations where she will say, well, don't think that we have the last word. Don't think we have arrived. We have much to learn and much to unlearn. So those are other things where we will, create openings for continued study of this book, and to make it, in some ways, to retrieve it from the way it has been taken hostage by reading traditions that we could improve on. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, you have posted several questions. It's your turn to present present one of those.
Okay, the first one is, please comment on who John of Patmos was, the apostle or someone else.
Well, when I wrote my commentary, I wrote a long exposition of that. And then I was told by the publisher and the editors that I had to make it shorter, and I had to make it much shorter than the manuscript I had submitted. It was almost like we were at the point of deal breaking, because they wondered if I would be able to cut it, to bring it down to the right size. I had exceeded the word limit by 100,000 words, and they told me, well, we will give you 50,000 extra words, but you have to cut, 50,000 of the words that you have, at least 50,000, maybe 60,000. So I thought about it for a moment, and then would I be able to do it? And I said, I think I can do it. So I did, and they were happy with what I did. But one of the things where I had to cut was on the authorship. because I had a much longer discussion about authorship. And the issue is, that the author of the Gospel of Revelation calls himself John, John, and he refers to himself in the same way that Daniel does in the book of Daniel, Daniel. It's very similar. But the author of the Gospel of John is nowhere identified except to say that there was a disciple whom Jesus loved. He is said to be the source of that gospel, but he is nowhere identified or named as John. So there is an issue here, that there is a John in Revelation, and there is a John in the Gospel of John and among the disciples of Jesus, and the question is whether he is the same person. Most scholars do not think that these are the same, that it's the same author. If you assign the Gospel of John to John, then the John of Revelation would be some other John. If you assign Revelation to John the disciple, then the author of Revelation of the Gospel of John might either be unknown or some other person. Now, I tend to see that the case for joint authorship, or that they come from the same sort of authorial provenance, I think that case is doable. The objection to it is the language, that there is a style of language that is very different. But the themes, the theological themes of these books are very similar. And the way the cosmic perspective, the prince of this world, will be thrown out in the Gospel of John in chapter 12, and the cosmic war in Revelation, in the midpoint of Revelation, they are thematically very similar. So and it is not just because I have in some ways bowed to Adventist convention, thinking that they are the same, the author could be the same person. I do think that is a better explanation, actually, than the alternative explanations. I think that is also one way to adjudicate the merits of a position, is whether there are other explanations that are better explanations. And I do not think the other explanations are very good. It would be fantastic if you would find two people who could write the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, one writing John and one writing Revelation. It would be fantastic if you could find two people. But I think it is more unlikely to find two people than to find one. That's how amazing these books are, that I think thinking that they have that they come from a similar or same authorial hand is somewhat easier to believe than that there are two. But I'm not saying that you need. I do not feel I need to win that argument. That one needs to settle that issue is decisive for how you read them. But there are some very interesting thematic parallels and linguistic parallels between these two books that must be taken seriously. But the chapter or the part where I wrote about that, I have written a much longer exposition of that than I could include in my commentary, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Jeffrey has come up with a comment or question, and so we'll go to Jeffrey's first question and then to Peter and hopefully back to Carol. Jeffrey.
It's totally be visible, baby.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Donna.
Okay, my question is, I'm sorry, I've been ill, and so I'm not. My question in a way tags on to the one you just answered. In other words, do you have a sort of this is a purely factual question, a timeline for the date when the book of Daniel was written, the Gospel of John was written, and now the Revelation of John the somebody was written. Just for curiosity, because as I understood one of the main arguments that was given by Dr. Collins to us a while back, in which she took the more popular, apparently, view among scholars. She took the position that it was written by someone else, and not only based on language differences, but also on the timeline. That even were he very young, when he was Jesus' disciple, John would have been, 100 and something when he wrote Revelation. And I'm also very interested in what the author, whoever it was, the emphasis he places on items from, or things from the book of Daniel. Was the book of Daniel written in close proximity to the book of Revelation, or in fact, hundreds, perhaps, or more years? That's it, Sigve. And thank you, by the way. I have to add my thanks to everyone. A lovely presentation, both of the history and the toehold into theology. You remind me of John Milton's Paradise Lost, which he says he wrote, quote, to justify the ways of God to man. I'm not sure that can be done, but somebody was trying. I'm sorry, I have to figure out how to get away from here.
Thank you, Donna. Well, one cannot answer these questions conclusively, and one really has to be quite humble, because there are different timelines for all those books. There's a huge difference of opinion about the time of the book of Daniel, where the Adventist view is distinctively a minority opinion about it being written for 500 years BC. That's not the view of most critical scholars today. So there is a dispute about the time of that book. And then there is similar divergence or differences of opinion about the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. There is a tendency to think that you can assign Revelation toward it during the time of Domitian, and he ruled from 84 to 96, the end of the first century. The timing of the Gospel of John used to be very late. Used to be thought that was into the second century, 20, 30 years into the second century, and then it has been moved back. And one paradigm-changing book on the Gospel of John is a book called The Priority of John, written by John Robinson, who dates the Gospels and most of the books in the New Testament much earlier than used to be the case before he wrote his book. And he thinks that the Gospel of John is the best source of in the sort of history of Jesus. Then the Gospel of John should be the foundation rather than the Gospel of Mark. So I think we just have to savor that we entertain various options here, and that the timing is an important question. It is probably not achievable to say exactly when those two New Testament books were written. And it is there is differences of opinion about who wrote them. The majority of scholars do not think that the same person wrote them.
I was mainly wondering if the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation were actually written, or people think they were actually written, more close to each other in time than when we think of it, even if we forget for a moment John,
Yes.
The Gospel of John and of Mark.
Yeah, but even if you give the book of Daniel a late date, say 2nd century BC, you will have close to 300 years between Daniel and Revelation. So there will still be a considerable time, and there will be, Daniel is written partly in Hebrew, partly in Aramaic, and of course, by Revelation is written in Greek, even though it is written in Greek by someone who thought like, maybe he thought in Semitic ways, you know, that he was like me who writes English, even though I'm a foreigner.
Okay,
You write
thank
better
you.
English than many of us.
Simona? Simona, I have three people, repeat questions. I got Peter and then Carol and Eduardo. So I'm going to propose that we see if we can't get hear from those three, their final questions or comments, and then call it a wrap.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
Let's go to Peter.
As I mentioned, Sigve's presentation was very challenging, and I have a lot of things to mention, but I will limit myself to the second one, and I'll stop here if the time doesn't allow us. Sigve, when you mentioned that in the history, myths are created, you're talking about how in American history the myth related to the project of 1619. And you mentioned that as I understood, as something valuable, historically accurate. My point of view is that this 1619 project is not a historically project, it's more a politically project, politically motivated. Why I'm arguing this is because the history of the United States, it doesn't begin in 1619. It begins with the Declaration of Independence. In 1619, there were American colonies under the British government and British authority. And we cannot accuse the United States of slavery in 1619. Yes, some ships with slaves were coming, but as I said, this was under British authority, legal authority, not American authority. American authority started more than a century later, 1776. Then that's my point of view in regard to your 1619 mentioning this project.
Well, I'm very happy that you bring that up. So let me try to restate what I meant by making that point or making that comparison. So the Roman Empire promotes a myth in its writings, in its rituals, in its celebrations, in its, you know, the equivalent of 4th of July or whatever they had, you know, the religious feasts. They promote a myth of power, stability, prosperity, freedom. But they never tell you about slavery. They do not show you that because they don't like that. That is a kind of no-no. That impairs the national myth. And one of the things that I have written about in my Romans commentary, but not mentioned in my Revelation commentary, is that, of course, the civil rights of slaves was non-existent in Roman times. You could, if you had slaves, you could take them down on the street corner, like to a tire store, and you could have your slave crucified. And you paid about, you know, $15 to have your slave crucified. And you went home again. There was not, but that is such an embarrassment to Roman history writing that nobody mentions it. It is a gaping hole. So what I meant by that analogy with I mentioned the 1619 project is because there are some things in the way a country like the US tells its story that also tends to leave out things that are unpleasant, that are unfavorable to that story. such as the book by Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told. That is a compelling book. I highly recommend it. And Anna Nicole Smith, because I picked up this book recently in Virginia or in Washington, D.C. I was there in March. And she was criticized because she said that the emancipation, that the Declaration of Independence had in it that they wanted to have independence for the US so they could continue slavery. And she was criticized for that, and she has walked that back somewhat. So she doesn't stand on that quite as firmly as she did. But even if you want to say that US history starts in 1796 or 1776, I'm sorry, even if you want to say that it starts then, it starts as a slave country. And the president, George Washington, is a slaveholder. And Thomas Jefferson in his lifetime had 600 slaves who built Monticello for him. So it is a slave country, and the narrative of slavery is not it's not represented in the way you write history. So there is myth making. There are national myths. There is even a small country like Norway has some myths, but we are such a small country that these myths are not so damaging because we have no influence. But countries that are important and have influence, when they create myths, it can really create havoc in the world. Vladimir Putin is currently acting out a Russian national myth to devastating consequences in the world. And so I am very respectful of what Hannah Nicole Jones has done with the 1619 project. It is historically a work of quality, even if one can quibble over some of the specifics. But I was just doing a comparison. I was saying that in Roman times, they tried to make people feel that they lived in the best of times. And in our time, we try to make our citizens think that we live in the best of times and there has never been anything better. But as we tell those kinds of stories, there are very many poor people in the world and many poor people in America and many people who don't have health insurance and all kinds of things, so we tend to leave some of those things out. And preterist readers of Revelation are interested in those things. And I commend them for that. I think they are what they bring to bear on the text there. I don't want to be against it, even though I have another view of the overarching story in Revelation.
Can I quickly add?
Yes, Peter.
As you know, the history of slavery in the United States is a very complex one. You mentioned Thomas Jefferson, that he has slaves. Yes, he has over 100 slaves.
He had 600.
Right. And but he was ideologically, he understood that slavery is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Madison also. And there is something that we should notice, that the expansion of the United States toward the east, was on the condition that in addition to the 13 colonies, the territories that will be acquired toward the east should not adopt slavery. They understood that it's something wrong with this. I mean, it's more complicated. History of slavery is not the way that I just say, well, United States was in favor of slavery and practiced slavery, yes, but also there were some restrictions, and the fathers understood that there are some problems with slavery.
Well, if I hear you say that you think we should say less about that subject, then I will say we should say more about it.
We have Eduardo, last question.
Thank you. Sigve, when you look to Revelation 1:3, the time is at hand or the time is short, and you go to Revelation last verse, I'm coming soon. Humanity do not think that there is a period of at least 1260 years or 1844, the judgment of God in 1844. You don't think that this is a mistranslation? Because why don't we use the text where Jesus said, immediately after those days? And I think that immediately after those prophecies, those centuries are coming, because humanity cannot conceive soon with a period of at least 1260 years. What do you think?
Well, there are many interesting time elements in Revelation, and you mentioned the one at the beginning and the end, soon or quickly. That's an adverbial sort of general time thing, and Revelation uses that term and says soon. So it has other terms too: half an hour, 3.5 days, 10 days, 5 months, the hour, the day, the month, and the year, 42 months, 1260 days. It has many interesting time elements, and we can and they are deserving of study. But I think your time word is a great one. Maybe that is the one should concentrate most on. I come soon, or the time is soon, or quickly. In the end, when Jesus says, I'm coming soon, or I'm coming quickly, I'm coming as fast as I can, emphasis. And I have a presentation about this topic in my series of presentations on Revelation, where I say that the time element in Revelation that is most important is the time element that isn't mentioned in the book. It is implied. And that time element is not soon, or it is not 1260 days. It is in the meantime. In the meantime, what do you do in the meantime? That is the element. That is the time that is available to us. And there is nothing to speculate about. There is in some ways a commission in the book that says the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let those who hear it say, come, and the one who is thirsty, let him come. And then all of this in the setting of coming soon. But I think the time element most important in this book is in the meantime. And I hope we can talk about that at some future point. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, and for your question.
We have one more question. I'm sorry, I
Oh, you
wasn't
have one more
aware.
question.
Yes,
Sure.
Carol, please go ahead.
I was wondering, in your commentary, you posed the possibility of the apostate church as one manifestation of Babylon. And I wondered how widespread is that interpretation among other commentators, disregarding the Reformation emphasis on the Roman Catholic Church.
I don't think that view as kind of an application is a view held. I mean, that history turned out to show that the church drifted away and the church apostatized, or that view of history, that of course is kind of Reformation reading of history, that something went wrong and then it had to be remedied. But most people who read the concept of Babylon in Revelation, they think that Babylon is a cipher, a figure of speech for the Roman Empire. And they think that it is a religious political entity that is hostile to God and hostile to God's interest in the world. The weakness of saying that it is, secular Rome or Roman imperial reality is that Revelation talks about that Babylon as a prostitute. It is very much focusing on the prostitution, the element of unfaithfulness. And in the Old Testament, when there is prostitution, it is usually Israel that is called the prostitute. It is not so much Babylon or the countries that are against Israel. It is Israel itself that was pure and became violent and so fell away. So the notion of Babylon to include a sort of apostate Christianity is not completely illegitimate. There are textual things to make you think that the element of prostitution that is emphasized there is the fallenness of Babylon in some ways then draws on language describing the fallenness of Israel as a faithful woman and then unfaithful in many of those texts. So I have a long exposition of that in my commentary, but that would be for another time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Back to you, Simona.
Thank you very much, Sigve, for your time and for an outstanding presentation and your answers. We hope you can stay with us a little bit longer after we end the formal part of this for our digital foodless potluck, where we sometimes continue the discussion. I would like to bring us maybe back to an aspect that you have mentioned. It's the beginning and the end, the parallels, the mirroring of the Genesis, the beginning of the creation, and then the restoration of the creation in the book of Revelation. And both, if you look between these two ends, everything that the Bible is trying to do is to reveal the character of God. And there are so many competing ideas, so many lies, so many blasphemies that are presented to us. And God is constantly trying to kind of cut through that and reveal himself as the creator, as the savior, as the one who cares. God of love. I'm going to end this presentation with a text from one of my favorite books. The book is entitled Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. There are two occasions when the sacred beauty of creation becomes dazzlingly apparent, and they occur together. One is when we feel our mortal insufficiency to the world, and the other is when we feel the world's mortal insufficiency to us. Augustine says the Lord loves each of us as an only child, and that has to be true. He will wipe the tears from all faces. It takes nothing from the loveliness of the verse to say that is exactly what will be required. Theologians talk about the prevenient grace that precedes grace itself and allows us to accept it. I think there must also be a prevenient courage that allows us to be brave, that is to acknowledge that there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm. And therefore, this courage allows us, as the old man said, to make ourselves useful. It allows us to be generous, which is another way of saying exactly the same thing. Our benediction for today is the peace of God be in your heart, the grace of God be in your words, the love of God be in your hands, the joy of God be in your soul, in the song that your life sings. Amen.